Hello, Internet. It's Daniel with Driving and Dragons. And today, coming to you with a response/reaction video to The Basic Expert. Now, I watched this video a little while back, caught it in my stream, and was like, man, I kind of disagree with him on some things. It's one of those fun things where really I think the straw men have run off with the real arguments and some of the real definitions here, and things have kind of gotten off base. So it's this funny thing where I largely agree with the content of his argument as a response to what he's responding to. However, there are some strong misconceptions, misuse of terms, and that sort of things that really kind of takes it off base and can make it confusing or incorrect to people who really kind of understand the terminology that's used. So let's go ahead and take a look-see here at what we've got going on with the Basic Expert.
How's it going, guys? John the Basic Expert here. I love old school games, and since I've started to playtest Makuhito over the summer, my white box clone that is taking place in an Aztec setting, I've come to really love the very first iteration of the game. Now, if you are like me, you often find yourself discussing games in person or online and run into a particular kind of person.
These suck. You're not even like heroic. You have like one hit die. It's just dumb mudcore. Those stupid old school gamers and their dumb mudcore of like level 1 to 3, where they just are like crawling through the mud and then they die. Terrible, terrible games. I hate this. This is great gaming. This is super heroic high fantasy gaming. It's way closer than the sword and sorcery of Robert E. Howard that Gygax intended than anything that is. Ugh, this is much better.
Okay, so right off the bat, we have the part where the problem comes in. Now, the funny thing is this video is a clear straw man of the traditional argument, or the traditional, it's not even an argument, it's really just an observation that older D&D is not heroic fantasy. It's basic fantasy, it's sword and sorcery, and that modern D&D, in particular, 3.5 forward, is heroic, or third edition forward really, is heroic fantasy. And this would be a straw man at that point. Oh, it's not even real this, it's that. But the funny thing is it's kind of gone into that, where that straw man of that argument has become truly represented among a lot of the 5e player base in particular, because the 5e player base, a lot of them don't even really understand the different kinds of fantasy anyway. But he also shows in here, in this straw man, the lie of the argument. Oh, no, this is much closer to the sword and sorcery, of Conan the Barbarian, Robert E. Howard, and, the way that Gary Gygax intended. Let me put this out here for you. Words have definitions for a reason. And the straw man in here is both correct and incorrect. Yes, 5e is heroic fantasy. Original 0e, original Dungeons and Dragons prior to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, even AD&D, is not heroic fantasy. Because heroic fantasy does not just mean there's heroes. It means, or that there's heroic characters. Heroic fantasy is probably more accurately described as superhero fantasy. All right. And I'll get into some of those differences moving forward, because otherwise I'll just put everything out there now, and then the rest of the video is, the rest of the Basic Experts video kind of becomes irrelevant, and you end up having to flip back and forth. So let's see what he says, and we'll go along with it.
I think this person is objectively wrong. I think, and maybe this is controversial, that 0E is one of the most heroic versions of D&D ever created. Let me explain how.
Okay, so he's about to go into his description, and he's going to be correct. But you'll notice how, and this is and I don't think he's doing this to be disingenuous. I don't think he's intending it in that way. He's literally arguing against the straw man, and he's not making the straw man. Don't get that wrong. The straw man is now actually a legitimate argument, a poor argument based on misconceptions that a lot of the 5e crowd actually put out now. Kind of like when generic Jenny D wants to try and talk about the history of Dungeons and Dragons when she has no clue what she's talking about. At best, she's parroting something that's fourth-hand knowledge from somebody who told her and relating it back to 5th edition. She doesn't have that experience or that knowledge of her own. So you get these kind of stupid arguments, and what he's going to say is correct against that argument. But you'll notice the little twist that he just made there. And normally, if you were in debate, this would be considered a tactic in poor form. He went from heroic fantasy to this being one of the most heroic games or having heroic characters. And I'm going to tell you why. That's not the same thing. Heroic fantasy is in itself its own particular genre. All fantasy really has heroes in it. But heroic fantasy is a very specific kind of hero.
In the foreword to Dungeons & Dragons, Gary says the following: "These rules are strictly fantasy. Those wargamers who lack imagination, those who don't care for Burroughs' Martian adventures where John Carter is groping through black pits, who feel no thrill upon reading Howard's Conan saga, who do not enjoy the DeCamp and Pratt fantasies, or Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse are pitting their swords against evil sorceries, will not be likely to find Dungeons & Dragons to their taste." I find it hard to believe that Gary would reference John Carter, Conan, and Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser while simultaneously making a game where you are some pathetic pig farmer who might survive to higher levels.
And you see, and there it comes in. That goes right back to what I was saying. That's because Gary Gygax was not referencing heroic fantasy. He was referencing pulp fantasy and sword and sorcery. Grey Mouser, Carter, DeCamp and Sprague, Robert E. Howard, Krull the Conqueror, which was also Howard. These old pulp, these all came from old pulp fantasy. These are not pulp. Like these are not heroic fantasy. These are more what would be considered low. Some of them are very much low fantasy, and some of them are sword and sorcery fantasy. There are a few of them that kind of qualify as high fantasy, but most of them are low fantasy and sword and sorcery, which is its own specific thing. They are not heroic fantasy. So you can kind of see how basically he's allowing the poor definition to the incorrect definition to make his argument correct here, mainly because he's arguing against a premise that the person making that argument doesn't understand.
Maybe a majority of people just misunderstood the rules. The key to understanding all this is chainmail. Volume 1 of the 3 LBBs references chainmail as a suggested resource. Of course, you can play a version of the game with just the 3 LBBs, but chainmail really adds something to the game. Mixing chainmail with the alternative combat system, which would go on to be the D20 system we are all familiar with, is key to making this heroic game that I am talking about. And the key is fighting capability. Looking at the fighting capability on page 17 of Volume 1, you see things like man +1, 2 men +1, and other such things listed for the fighting man class. The rules on the next page for this is for referencing chainmail abilities, where, for instance, a level 3 fighting man has a fighting capability of 3 men or hero -1. But I think these stats need to be used even when the alternative combat system is being used and you're not exclusively using chainmail. But let's look at what chainmail says about heroes, a title all classes in 0E can obtain.
Okay, so even right there in the portion of the rules that he just showed and the section he's about to go into, once again kind of goes to prove this point. You'll notice that when you're playing, the majority of the game you're playing as man, or then you're getting into hero status. It is something you can obtain. That is a big part of what takes it out of heroic fantasy. Generally, the obtaining heroic part in obtaining hero status in heroic fantasy happens very, very quickly and very, very early on. In fact, the argument would actually be that, like in a 5th edition game, in a 3rd edition game, you're basically a hero at level 1. You're already super heroic. By the time you're 3rd or 4th level, you are a superhero type character. And in 5th edition, it's even more pronounced, to where you might spend 1 level as what we would call like a regular hero, and 2nd level on, you're in the superhero realm as a player character. And this is most easily seen by the separation of NPC classes and PC classes in the 3.5 edition Dungeon Master's Guide, where it talks about most people don't have these player class levels. They only have these levels. And even if they're 10th or 15th level, they're still way, but they still never have access to those really powerful, almost supernatural, and in some cases, actually supernatural abilities that the player characters have. And that is a core of heroic fantasy, as opposed to regular fantasy. And like I said, I will get into that. Normally I would start with definitions, but I'll get into the true definitions here later. And then you can kind of go back and say, am I right? Or is the basic expert right on this? And that there really is the heroic fantasy of it. And there will be a caveat to this as well.
Included in this class are certain well-known knights, leaders of army contingents, and similar men. They have the fighting ability of 4 figures, the class being dependent on the arms and equipment of the hero types themselves, who can range from light foot to heavy horse. Heroes and anti-heroes need never check morale and add 1 to the die or dice of their unit, or whatever unit they are in. This implies that a hero character attacks as 4 men against regular units. This is where many games like White Box, FMAG, and Delving Deeper get this concept of multiple attacks against low hit die foes. This is further elaborated on in the monster section, where similar mechanics are expressed. Page 5 of Volume 2 says the following: attack or defense capabilities versus normal men are simply a matter of allowing 1 roll as a man type for every hit die, with any bonuses being given to only 1 of the attacks, i.e. a troll would attack 6 times, once with a +3 added to the die roll. A troll's hit die code is 6 + 3, meaning 6 hit die are rolled, 66s, and 3 is added to the total. But it's clear that such a creature also gets 6 attacks as a normal man, with 1 attack gaining a +3 to hit. This is terrifying. However, this would only work against normal men, which of course means lower level player characters should rightfully be terrified of trolls. However, what constitutes a normal man? In Strategic Review Volume 1, Number 2 from summer of 1975, it says the following: when fantastic combat is taking place, there is normally only 1 exchange of attacks per round, and unless the rules state otherwise, a 6-sided die is used to determine how many hit points of damage is sustained when an attack succeeds. Weapon type is not considered, save where magical weapons are concerned. A superhero, for example, would attack 8 times only if he were fighting normal men, or creatures basically that strength, i.e. kobolds, goblins, gnomes, dwarves, and so on. It later says, in a combat example, assume the following dice score by the hero. Note that he is allowed 1 attack for each of his combat levels, as the ratio of 1 orc versus the hero is 1:4. So this is treated as normal, non-fantastic melee, as is any combat where the score of one side is a base of 1 hit die or less. Pretty clear, pretty dry, but this is much later, and Greyhawk has already been released and fundamentally changed the game to a large degree. This is where many clones get the rule that fighters attack multiple times against 1 hit die foes, and this is one interpretation. But this is after Greyhawk fundamentally changed the game and made it closer to what we understand today. But let's pretend it's 1974, Greyhawk and Strategic Review Volume 1, Issue 2 has not been released yet. This is the era of gaming I am most interested in, the era of rules prior to any Greyhawkisms. What constitutes a, quote, normal man? Since Hero is the lowest level presented in the fantasy supplement in Chainmail, I would argue anything below that is, quote, normal. For a fighting man, this is 4 hit die and level 4. For magic users, it's level 8 and 5 hit die. For clerics, it's level 7 and 6 hit die. For monsters, it is simply based on the hit die given our troll example. This is reinforced by elves and ghouls. Elves cap at level 4 for fighters and level 8 for magic users, which coincidentally is the level both classes gain the hero level fighting ability. Ghouls specifically say the following in their information. As stated in Chainmail, for whites, ghouls paralyze any normal figure they touch, excluding elves. They otherwise melee in the regular fashion and are subject to missile fire. Any man type killed by a ghoul becomes one. Elves essentially start out with a heroic ability, that being immunity to a ghoul's paralysis, and are capped at the heroic level for both classes because this is an early game heroic ability. There's going to be some trade-offs. Therefore, pre-Greyhawk and any strategic review, any character with multi-man abilities may make multiple martial attacks against normal foes. Normal foes being defined as any creature with 3 hit die or less, with exceptions like ghouls and other outliers. Chainmail is again clear that heroes are almost one-man armies with their fighting ability since they equal 4 men. This means levels 1 through 3 for the fighting man are still normal, but against other normal foes, the fighting man gains multiple attacks. So at level 2, he has 2 attacks. At level 3, 3. This is powerful. And again, clerics and magic users are not barred from this ability if we are referencing Chainmail. Pre-Greyhawk 0E is actually heroic gaming, not mudcore.
Okay, so not mudcore. I'm going to throw the whole mudcore out the window because it's really just a derisive term that's being used by, really by the 5th edition crowd. I don't think I've ever really heard it used among, I mean, even 3.5 players. I don't think I've ever really heard use it that much. I've very rarely heard it there. It's generally the younger, newer 5e crowd. But notice he went to, once again, not heroic fantasy, but heroic gaming. Now, the real argument is that it is heroic fantasy versus basic fantasy or sword and sorcery. And the lie to that argument is told actually in this last description he's had here. Because let's listen to it. He talks about how, this elf basically starts with a heroic ability. And, once you get to level 4, you don't have this. Once you get to level 5, level 8, for these clerics and these different classes, you get to these heroic levels. You start at these heroic levels in most other D&D versions. You start with what would normally be considered a heroic ability. There is no disputing that the individual power level of the character, of the player characters, scaled dramatically from 0E forward. Starting with AD&D, it had a big jump, but it had a huge jump in 2nd ed, and then another massive jump in 3rd. And it's just continued onward and onward. The section of the 3.5 DM's guide that I was referencing earlier says, the player's handbook extensively describes adventurers. But what about the rest of the world? Surely not everyone's a rogue, fighter, or wizard. Presented in this section are 5 classes specifically designed for NPCs. None of them, with the possible exceptions of the expert and the aristocrat, stands up to a player class for PCs. Instead, they represent the rest of the people in the world around the PCs who don't train and go on adventures and explore dungeons. So what that's basically saying is, and I've said this before, and this is the expression I typically use. When you get to 3rd, 4th, 5th edition, and arguably 2nd, a 1st level player class character is already an Olympian, like an Olympian, if not an Olympic medalist, is already a professional, is already a top of the line. They're already in the 1% by being a 1st level character. By the time you're a 5th level, like, I'll give you an example. Michael Jordan is like a 5th or 6th level basketball player with really, really good stat rolls. LeBron James is a 5th or 6th level basketball player. Kobe Bryant is a 5th or 6th level basketball player. Larry Bird is a 5th or 6th level basketball player. All right. Your entry level bench warmer in the NBA is a 1st level basketball player. Your college players and your college players and your high school players and stuff, those are NPC class basketball players. Okay. In 3rd or 5th, 3rd through 5th edition, 2nd edition. When you talk about original Dungeons and Dragons, it's more along the lines of, for the first 4 levels or so, if you're a human fighter, we'll use the fighter as an example. For those first 4 levels, you're high school, college level at best. You're not even trying out for the pros until 5th. You're not a Bird or a Jordan until you're way on up there in the, quote, superhero ranks. And that is part of the difference there. And that is part of how you can gauge that it's not a heroic fantasy. And at least not as normally presented. You can do anything with these games. You can make a 3.5 world where every single person in town is a 2nd or 3rd level player character class, and you're really starting out below average at level 1. You can make a super powered world where your characters are not up there, that are not that much bigger and badder than the average person. But that's not the way it's written or the way it's intended, as clearly referenced there in the 3.5 Dungeon Master's Guide, where it flat out says these represent the rest of the world, people who don't professionally go into dungeons to seek their fortunes and fight wars and stuff like that. Your town guards are not fighters, they're warriors. And they don't have a bunch of the abilities that fighter has. Whereas in 0E, to convert it to 3.5, you would say before you can get your first level of fighter, you have to have 4 to 5 levels of warrior. Then you can progress into fighter.
Well, that's going to do it for this video, guys. I hope you found it interesting. I think 0E.
Okay, so that's the end of this thing. And rather than listen to him say, look, check out his games, check out his OSR stuff, his Azul Aztec game that he's made that's kind of a 1E, 0E clone that's plays in the Aztec. Really got a lot of respect for him, but let's go ahead and level out these definitions, I promised, so I can kind of put out why the case is that he's both right and wrong. He's right against the argument that's put forth by the straw man in the beginning of the video. Mainly because, like I said, it's come to the point where the straw men are marching, and the real argument or the real observation really that is kind of indisputable is left in the dust by the fact that parroting this, basically you got a bunch of people parroting terms that they don't understand the meaning of to try and make it derisive towards old school games, which is stupid. But even then, he uses some disingenuous debate tactics in it when he hits the argument by very subtly changing the term from heroic fantasy to heroic gaming or having heroic characters. And here's why. There is a definition of really the word heroic. And yes, there are clearly heroes in these old games. Just like we use Conan the Barbarian as an example. He is a hero. He is heroic. But, and there is some argument that you could say maybe he's a superhero in a way, but not really. He is shown to have prodigious strength and stamina that is well beyond anything, mainly because he's Sumerian and because he was a Sumerian who was gifted beyond normal Sumerians and raised in a particularly hard way, that all added up to him being stronger and having more stamina and more durability and some better instincts than pretty much every human. But at the same time, you still have him being clearly overpowered by multiple people. You still have him being brought down when 3 and 4 guys get on him. You still have him like very, very, just the inkling of magic being a major problem for him. And his abilities are largely confined to only slightly exaggerated reality of this world. He climbs a rock face that a normal man would struggle, but still has handholds and stuff. It's not smooth as glass. He performs feats of strength that are like strongman level, but they're not so far. He doesn't lift a bus. He lifts a portcullis that would normally take 2 men to lift by himself, and he can force it up, or he breaks something like, kind of like when the big strong men come in and they fold a cast iron skillet and roll it up, or they tear phone books in half or something like that. 99.9% of the population can't even start to do it, but it's still within the bounds of reality. That is fantasy. It can be sword and sorcery. It can be high fantasy. It can be low fantasy, which high and low fantasy just has to do with the world. Like low fantasy, it's a real simple definition. High fantasy is not Earth and not our world and not necessarily our physics. Low fantasy is supposed to be Earth. Like, so for instance, Lord of the Rings is actually low fantasy because that is a mythical prehistory to Earth. And then sword and sorcery is generally more grounded in reality. And magic is seen the way magic would be seen if you came across it in this world, something that is super superstitious, very rare, has a lot of ritualism to it. And fantasy, or just, your kind of basic fantasy, encompasses more or less everything. These are all genres of fantasy. But that's the realm of original Dungeons and Dragons. Heroic fantasy is when you start getting into things where the main characters or the hero characters and the villain characters are all well beyond normal and are far more special. And not special because, you happen to be the great grandson of the original wielder of the Poobah sword and you're the only one who can use it. But I'm talking about things like, for instance, Elminster. Elminster is, even starting off, ends up like, Elminster Making of the Mage. You read that book, it doesn't take long before Elminster is many, many things above everybody around him. And he's in Forgotten Realms, which is an extremely high fantasy, extremely high magic world with a lot of very powerful people in it. But he's breaking the rules of reality and violating the laws of physics and stuff pretty early in his career. And then, of course, he ends up being world bending. Same thing when you start looking at, say, Dragonlance. Dragonlance, the characters are kind of portrayed as low-level characters, and it's definitely portrayed in a much more low magic setting than, say, Forgotten Realms. But it's still heroic fantasy because these characters are gifted and powerful beyond pretty much everyone around them. And the only challenges that they really face are overwhelming odds, magical creatures, and, the direct intervention of gods and supernatural beings. They're not ever really challenged in general by fighters, by just enemy soldiers. Sturm Brightblade can hold the gate against everybody until Takesis arrives, or not Takesis, until Kitiara arrives, who's another super powered heroic character. Same thing with Dritsto Urden. Dritsto Urden is never really challenged unless it's by colossally overwhelming odds. Even when he's very, very young, he is immediately cut so far above everybody else in his natural abilities. I mean, he defeats and he basically escapes an entire society that's against him of super powered characters and is shown to be a super high level above everything else. We meet him in the Crystal Shard, easily taking on gigantic creatures and Rimras and things of that nature, almost single-handedly. These are, Conan would not have that ability. Conan would be severely damaged and very, that would be a thing that could bring him near to death, that only his extreme stamina and whatnot allows him to escape it somehow. And he escapes it. He doesn't kill it. Or if he kills it, it's just barely. Or, he wounds it and it runs off. He doesn't just whip the shit out of a bunch of frost giants the way Drizzt Do'Urden did. Drizzt Do'Urden goes in and kills several giants, including a frost giant, with him and his panther. Him and Brunor Battlehammer, just the two of them. That's heroic fantasy. Okay? And a better way to say it is like super heroic fantasy. That's really a better way to say it. Superhero fantasy is what you would truly call heroic fantasy. So if your party isn't like the Avengers assembling at level 1 and 2 and 3, getting their pieces together and finding the new thing, they're Tony Stark getting the, super powered nuclear chest and the armor suit in the terrorist caves. If that's not the early levels, you're not in a heroic fantasy setting. So he's really making an argument against a bad argument to start with, that has been bastardized out of the observation that it is. Because truly, old school D&D, even old school AD&D, is not heroic fantasy. And it shouldn't be heroic fantasy. That's part of the reason why a lot of the OSR crowd like it more, is because it's more grounded, more realistic, and it is less fantasy. It is less, I have 15 magical abilities that can solve this. Whereas a game like 5th edition or 3.5 or 4th edition, but we'll use 5th edition as the example here. 5th edition is clearly heroic fantasy. I mean, the existence of cantrips where you don't even have limits on your 0 level spells and stuff kind of shows it. A level 1 warlock can blast people like he's Dragon Ball Z with his Eldritch Blast, and he can do it over and over and over again. That is not fantasy or a low fantasy setting or a sword and sorcery setting. That is high fantasy. That is heroic high fantasy, is what that is. So you're in this weird position where the straw man is actually correct when they say that one is heroic fantasy, the other is not, but doesn't actually understand what that really means. And then you have the basic expert arguing against nominally the premise, the correct premise, but really directing his arguments at the misunderstandings and the poor foundations that are presented by these 5e players. So that's what I've got on that. Tell me where I'm right, wrong. Give me your thoughts. What do you think in terms of heroic fantasy versus just having a heroic character? Because remember, you can be a heroic by having more power than everybody else and stepping in and doing good, or you can be heroic by overcoming immense odds all against you, which is what a Conan does, or a sword and sorcerer, a 0e character does, as opposed to I have all these superpowers and therefore I use them, like Superman or Goku or, Elminster or your typical 5th edition character. So tell me where I'm wrong. Tell me where I'm right. Leave a comment, please, because it helps boost us in the algorithm. Like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.